Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We are going to listen to Vengeance Killer Lovers. December 4th, 1985. It's another quiet night in the small town of Hanahan, South Carolina, until a little after 2 a.m., when an injured man stumbles into the police station on Yeamans Hall Road, covered in blood. The dispatcher on duty sees this guy come in, and from the looks of his wounds, it's clear he's been in some type of shooting. I think there were 3 or 4 gunshots to his head, as I recall. Because of the gunshot wounds, he was bleeding profusely. As you might imagine, a very dramatic scene. He'd been shot in the head, straight into his mouth. They immediately notified the police units as well as the fire EMS, which was right next door to us. Paramedics quickly arrived to administer first aid. In addition to his injuries, they noticed 2 other strange details. As they're working on him, they realize the shirt he's wearing is actually a pizza delivery uniform, and it looks like he'd been tied up. He had a piece of foam cord wrapped around his wrist, where apparently he'd been tied up. They immediately get an ambulance to transport him to the hospital, and the police officer hops in the ambulance trying to reassure him and find information. It's obviously difficult for him to communicate, but he was able to tell them there was a robbery at the pizzeria where he worked. He had managed to drive his truck about a block from the store and then had managed to stumble into the police department on foot. I have no idea other than that was God's will for him to make it there. Officers are dispatched to the location where they encounter a disturbing scene. The door was open, the lights were on. It was in disarray in certain areas, particularly the office and behind the counter. There was blood all over, and the phone cords had been removed. It looked like the aftermath of a robbery. The cash register and the safe were both open, and the cash was gone. They also find a second victim in the back of the store. It was another young man in the same uniform as the first victim. He'd been shot in the head, and he didn't survive. He was tied bound with a telephone cord, and he was deceased. From their driver's licenses, police are able to identify the 2 unfortunate pizza shop employees. A pair of 24-year-old men named Gary Melky and Christopher Zare. Chris was originally from Oakley, Kansas, and Gary was from Morehead City, North Carolina. They were both raised in very supportive families. Chris and Gary were pretty close friends. They'd been in the service together and known each other for many years. After Gary and Chris completed their naval training in the 1980s, they'd both been stationed in Charleston, South Carolina. Back in the 1980s, we had a big Navy presence in the Charleston area, and Gary and Chris worked at the Naval Hospital. And basically, the Naval Hospital treated Navy people and independents. They probably weren't making a big wage doing that, so they wanted to get part-time jobs to help supplement their income. They both started working at a pizza place in downtown Hanahan. Chris helped make and deliver pizzas, while Gary worked his way up to assistant store manager. It's probably not the kind of job 2 Navy guys are looking to turn into a career, but it paid the bills. They're working really late hours to make ends meet. By all accounts, they're just outstanding and upstanding citizens. But it seemed their part-time jobs had put the 2 men in the wrong place at the wrong time. An armed robbery has left Chris dead and Gary on his way to the hospital in critical condition. And investigators are combing the store for clues. Basically, there was no DNA known at the time. You can do blood samples and you can do fingerprinting and those kind of things. We had Charleston County's crime scene unit come over because they were really well equipped to process the crime scene. Fingerprints were going to be hard to isolate there because every customer and worker probably left prints there, but they did come up with one crucial piece of evidence. One of the bullets had exited the head of one of the victims, and we went back, and up under the counter, we found where one had stuck in the wall and dug it out. It was a .25 caliber weapon. Based on the evidence, it appears the thief had entered the pizza parlor around midnight, just before closing time. The assailant probably waited until they were the only 2 people left in the shop, and they pulled a gun on Gary and Chris. Well,
since Gary was the assistant manager, he was forced to open the cash drawer and the safe.
Someone with a loaded weapon was able to get Chris Sayre and Gary Melky on the floor, proceeded to use the phone cords that were available there in the business to tie them up.
He tied both of them up and then ransacked and then took whatever he could, primarily the cash. I think that was well over $1,100 had been stolen.
Any hope they might have had that their assailant would take the money and run quickly vanished.
The robber apparently decided not to leave any witnesses, so he shot Chris in the head at point-blank range.
I can only think what Gary Melky was thinking. Obviously, he knew he was going to be next, and he was next.
Amazingly, even after he was shot and left for dead, he was able to stay alive long enough to get to the police station.
But will Gary survive long enough to identify the killer? Coming up, police discover this isn't just a robbery gone wrong, but something far more sinister.
The entire case just had tremendous shock value.
Detectives in Hanahan, South Carolina are investigating a shooting at a local pizza parlor that has left Chris Sayre dead and Gary Melky in the hospital.
They were both shot execution style. Chris died instantly, but Gary was somehow able to survive.
ER doctors worked quickly to stabilize Gary's wounds.
He'd been shot 4 times in the temple, the jaw, the base of his skull, and his neck. It must have been touch and go for a while. One of the officers went with Gary to the hospital. Once hospital workers cleared his mouth of blood enough for him to talk, he asked if he could describe the shooter.
To their surprise, Gary says he knows exactly who shot him. A recently hired fellow Domino's employee named Mitchell Sims.
Gary was screaming in pain, but he was able to give a pretty good description of Sims, including the color of his hair.
We contacted the store manager, and he came to the scene and he pulled Mitchell Sims' application and provided it to us.
According to his records, Mitch was a 25-year-old part-time employee. He had not been working there very long.
When investigators contact Mitchell's family, however, they learn he has a checkered past. Mitchell Carlton Sims was raised in Columbia, South Carolina, as the youngest of 3 children.
What we learned in talking to the family was he had come from a broken home.
He apparently grew up in relatively humble beginnings. There may have been some abuse in his life.
At 18, he had enlisted in the Army, but he was forced to leave after only 2 years.
He had been dishonorably discharged after an incident there when he tried to frame a fellow soldier for shooting him.
He got involved with the wife of a military officer and came up with some kind of a plan where one of his buddies was going to shoot Mitchell, and then hopefully the husband of this woman would get the blame, and then Mitchell and she could be together. Now, this was a harebrained scheme that the authorities quickly saw through. The only person that was really hurt was Mitchell, because he actually was shot in the leg by his friend.
And then the military, through their investigation, they wound up charging him, and he did some time at Fort Leavenworth.
When he got out of prison in 1980, Mitch was 20 years old. He returned to Columbia, where he married a childhood friend, Teresa.
She was only 16 at the time, but she seemed to be the more mature of the two. They wound up having 3 kids together.
She kept him pretty well balanced, and she was a very nice lady.
In January of 1985, Mitch started working as a manager at a Domino's Pizza in Columbia.
On the surface, it appeared as though he was actually getting some level of success, and he was highly regarded and was doing very well. And then there was a dispute about the low pay.
And apparently had a falling out with his boss and had his bonus cut. He was upset.
Instead of moving on, Mitchell had apparently decided to fight back.
When he didn't get the bonus he felt he was entitled to, he tried to stage a coup with the other employees and get everyone to resign in protest.
He became involved in a strike against the company, but his coworkers did not join him, and so he was very bitter about that.
In May of that year, Mitchell even sent a formal complaint to corporate headquarters, but he never got a response and ultimately quit his job.
He was upset the way he was treated. He was disgruntled.
He did a series of odd jobs after that, but he could never make enough money to pay all the bills for the wife and the 3 kids, and she was very unhappy about that.
It put a lot of stress on the marriage, and it led to Mitch having an affair with a young woman he met during strike.
The young woman's name was Ruby Paget.
She's only 18 or 19 years old. I just sort of saw her as a person that was crying out for some love and some attention.
She came from a terrible background, and she'd run away from home and worked various low-level jobs and done a lot of drinking and drugging, and there were 2 lost souls that came together.
Mitchell ultimately left his wife and children to be with Ruby. They moved into a trailer together in North Charleston.
He was drinking more and more, and he was involved with Ruby, who liked to drink and do marijuana and speed or whatever else she could get her hands on, and so Mitchell joined her in that.
Ruby wasn't working, so Mitch had to support her too, and it didn't seem like she was all that happy with his effort.
What little income that he could earn was squandered on alcohol and drugs.
In November of 1985, Mitchell swallowed his pride and applied for a job at a different Domino's franchise, this time in Hanahan, South Carolina. But after only 2 weeks, it already wasn't going well.
They'd given him a part-time job delivering pizzas, but a couple of weeks after he started, his truck broke down and he couldn't afford to fix it, which means he couldn't deliver pizzas. He was basically worse off than when he started.
Considering Mitchell's history, it's not difficult to believe the setback could have driven him to commit armed robbery.
That was his way of getting money. He knew how the system operated. He knows where the cash is kept.
This is all because of his bruised ego over not getting a bonus.
Coming up, investigators search for their suspect becomes a nationwide manhunt.
He went to Firm Street, and he wanted to get revenge. He had a hunger to kill.
South Carolina police are looking for 25-year-old Mitchell Sims, who has been accused of murdering one coworker and leaving another fighting for his life after an armed robbery.
He already had the money when he shot them both execution style in close range in the head. It was very gruesome.
From talking to family members, they know that he's living in a trailer with his 20-year-old girlfriend, Ruby Paget. They just don't know where she fits into all this yet.
Investigators obtain the couple's address from Mitchell's job application.
We then met with North Charleston Police Department because the residence was in their jurisdiction. And we went over there, but we couldn't locate exactly which mobile home he lived in. We got a search warrant for it. And we went back over there the next morning, and that's when we found out which one he lived in.
But when officers enter the trailer, they quickly realize that they're too late.
During that time gap, Mitchell Sims and Ruby Paget, they were able to escape.
We had officers go to the airport and check all the airlines there. We had officers go to the bus station. We were checking all the motels in the area. It was all over the police radios.
The police told us Mitch Sims' name as soon as they found out because they needed the media's help to spread the word. They did give a picture out to all local TV stations just in case you're still in the area.
We ultimately developed some information that he might have taken a bus out of Charleston, and that's when we got with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they sent a couple agents out to work with us.
While the manhunt expands, investigators receive another piece of bad news.
Following surgery, Gary fell into a coma and never woke up. He died less than a week after the shooting. After everything he had been through, that was heartbreaking. Unfortunately, it also meant police wouldn't have his testimony, and that was their only evidence at that point.
With no witness and no leads, the case seems to be getting colder with each passing day. Until December 10th, a week after the armed robbery in Hanahan, South Carolina, police 2,500 miles away in Glendale, California, get a surprising call.
A young man named Richard Wagner says his information about a robbery that happened at a pizza store in Glendale.
Richard Wagner walked in just to visit his coworkers because he also works there, but he was off duty that night and saw this individual who he didn't know
Richard says the stranger came out of the back wearing an employee's shirt and answered the phone as if he worked there.
Something about it felt immediately off to him. Nobody in the store was acting the way they normally would.
His friends who were working there treated him strangely as if they didn't know him, so he quickly became suspicious.
You also saw him smoking a cigarette, which was a no-no under company policy.
Richard called his boss at a payphone. He agreed to meet Richard at the store to find out what's going on. But when they got there, they couldn't see anyone at all. They immediately called police.
Officers arrive within minutes. At first glance, the store appears to be empty. But when they open the walk-in cooler, they make a gruesome discovery.
There were two employees inside hanging from storage racks. They were standing on boxes and gasping for breath.
It seemed like a really grotesque form of torture. They were tied with their hands behind their back, with the rope going over a rack and the other end around their neck. They were having a great deal of trouble staying up off their toes so that they wouldn't choke to death.
Police quickly cut them down. The two victims turn out to be 41-year-old delivery driver Ed Sycamp and 19-year-old assistant manager Corey Spiroff.
They gave us jackets and blankets and whatever else they had to try to warm us up. They immediately started the questioning of just, what's the story, what happened?
Corey tells them that Ed stayed behind to help them close up for the night. Another employee, John Harrigan, was out making his last delivery.
I had already pulled the cash and I was making up my bank deposits. I heard someone come into the store.
Corey goes out front thinking it's John, but instead he finds two customers, a man with dark hair and a skinny blonde woman.
Corey tells police that before he could even say they were closed, the man pulled out a gun.
My whole being was sucked right into that barrel. Very calm. He just said, go back in the office. Ed was standing just off to the side, and he saw what was going on. He was instructed to come over, and we both went into the office. She had a long butcher knife. She was the one who was basically collecting the money, so I was giving the money to her. This was probably the perfect time for them to approach and rob us. It was the very end of the night. We were minutes from closing. We would have already begun to accumulate any cash or monies in the store to make the bank deposits.
Corey says he warned the couple that their delivery driver would be returning soon, but they didn't seem to care.
I said, if you hear someone come running in the door, don't panic. He's due back any moment now.
Corey said the man just took off his sweater and showed him what he had on underneath it. It was a pizza delivery uniform with John's name on it.
He sort of laughed and said, no, I don't think so. It was alarming. A whole bunch of thoughts go through your head on what happened and where's John.
Once the robbers collected all the money, they told Corey and Ed to both face the wall.
The wall, he had the gun up, extended out, and I was certain at that point that was when he was going to kill us.
But at that exact moment, they hear someone come into the store.
At that very moment, someone called out, hey, is there anybody here? So I looked back at him and then said, what do you want me to do? He put the gun in my head and said, don't do anything stupid, I'm going to blow this guy away.
Coming up, another victim with a familiar M.O.
The taking and killing of the employee, and then the way he tied the other employees up. He knew the ins and outs of the pizza operation.
Manager Corey Spiroff is telling Glendale police the harrowing story of a couple who robbed his pizza store at gunpoint. Corey believes the man was just about to kill him and his employee when they were interrupted.
Someone calls out from the front of the store, so he sends Corey to go deal with it while he holds Ed hostage. He gets out there and immediately recognizes his coworker, Richard Wagner, but he doesn't want him to get pulled into this too, so he plays it off like he doesn't know him.
I didn't acknowledge that I knew him. He sort of looked at me funny, didn't say anything outright, but he was trying to get my attention. And I continued to look down. I didn't acknowledge him. I asked him again, what would you like to order?
Luckily, Richard played along.
While Corey is taking Richard's order, the phone rings. At this point, the robber comes out from the office. He can't chance the fact that Corey won't call out for help.
He picked up the phone, answered, said, thank you for calling. This is Mitch. How can I help you? and proceeded to take an order for a delivery.
Corey finishes ringing up Richard's Pizza and tells him to go outside and wait in the car. He'll bring it out when it's done. But at that point, Richard has figured out what's going on and he calls police.
Corey says that's when the man calling himself Mitch decided to leave them in the walk-in cooler, and he'd come prepared with a rope.
He said, put your arms behind your back, and he took the end of the rope and looped it over the top of the metal shelf and pulled that back down and tied off around my neck. During the process of being tied, and I was in first, he brought Ed in, tied him, and I believe Ed was complaining a bit about how tight it was, or he was choking. The response very simply was, "So at least you're alive." We didn't know what was next. We didn't know if he was going to open the door and shoot us. We didn't know what was going to happen at that point. If we came off of our toes, we strangled. No matter how you move, no matter what you do, you're in pain. Your legs, your ankles, your calves are hurting, screaming. It's cold. It's probably 35 degrees in the cooler. By this time, we're bound, so we've got a loss of circulation. We've been in the cold for a while, so your fingers just don't even really work that well.
They couldn't. They were too cold. They would have died there, but for the fact that police were on their way. In fact, it was Richard Wagner's quick action that saved their lives.
Corey is thankful that he and Ed survived, but he's worried about what Mitch might have done to his other driver.
Corey told the police that John Harrigan had gone to make a delivery and had never come back, and that the person who robbed them had returned wearing Harrigan's shirt and name badge.
I asked him, "Where's John? What happened with John?" He said, "They'll find him after they find you."
Corey gave police the address for the last delivery, which was a motel not far from the store. When they get there, no one answers the door, so they get the manager to let them in. The first thing they notice is the sound of water running in the bathroom.
Inside, police find the dead body of a man submerged in the tub. He's been hogtied and gagged with a pillowcase over his head.
When homicide investigators get there, they notice the rope used to hogtie the victim is the same kind used on Ed and Corey, but it's still unclear if he died of strangulation or drowning.
The victim is identified as 21-year-old John Harrigan.
They robbed him of his pizza money, of his truck, his keys, and even his clothing.
Young man like that he would end up drowned in the bathtub over delivering pizza. How could someone do that?
30 minutes or more after the officers had gone to the motel to get John, a couple of them came back and they said there's been a homicide. It was devastating. It was, I couldn't believe it. It sort of hits you like a ton of bricks.
And when Glendale police contact the company's corporate office, they discovered that the suspect might also be connected to another case. A double homicide that occurred 2,500 miles away at their store in Hanahan, South Carolina, just 1 week earlier.
The two departments get together to compare notes, and the similarities between the two crimes are undeniable.
There are also very good evidence of modus operandi. It's the same motive for both murders. And Sims said on the phone, "This is Mitch." So that was another clue right there.
Investigative teams tear that motel room apart. They eventually find one conclusive piece of evidence that ties the murders together.
It very clearly been cleaned of any forensic evidence, but they did find one fingerprint on the inside of a toilet paper roll that matched to Mitchell Sims.
Once police have a suspect, they contact Corey Spiroff to identify him.
We learned probably in the next day or two that police contacted us and said, if something similar happened a week ago in South Carolina, we have some potential suspects and we'd like you to look at some pictures. 6 or 8 pictures on a page. As soon as they opened up that book and showed those pictures, it was him first. He jumped right off the page. There was no question, no doubt that was the individual.
Investigators are no longer looking for armed robbers. They're on the hunt for a pair of serial killers.
Both states have had innocent citizens cut down in the prime of their lives. There's no question Mitchell Sims committed these horrible crimes.
This wasn't about robberies. This was about making employees suffer. The way that he killed them was, in fact, torture.
John Harrigan's delivery truck is missing from the scene, and it looks like Mitch and Ruby may have taken it to flee the scene.
California police immediately issue a nationwide alert for the missing truck and the couple.
The FBI had already put his picture on all of the TV channels throughout America, and then they even got bigger, and he was getting ready to be put on the FBI's 10 most wanted list.
Coming up, investigators receive an anonymous tip, but can they catch the fugitives before they strike again?
The media had a field day with this case. They were like a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde.
Investigators from multiple law enforcement agencies around the United States are working around the clock to locate two suspected murderers, 25-year-old Mitchell Sims and his 20-year-old girlfriend, Ruby Paget.
It got a lot of attention from the press at the time. It was a sensational case. It was all over the news, all over the newspapers, the TV, the radio.
It became interesting because, number one, there were multiple killings, and secondly, involved a national corporation. The corporation took a very keen interest in this.
To assist in the search, Domino's Pizza offers up a $100,000 reward for any information leading to their capture.
I understood that this is a company that believes in its people, takes care of its people. They really stepped up with a substantial reward for the capture of these individuals.
I think they recognize that we need to bring to justice whoever is killing our innocent employees.
Nobody knew where they were. So there was real concern in the company, for sure, that it might happen again.
10 days later, on December 21st, officers in Las Vegas, Nevada, find an abandoned truck in a casino parking lot.
They run the plates and discover it's John Harrigan's missing truck. It had been wiped down just like the motel room, but inside they found John's uniform and his name tag.
So that tipped the police off to their general location.
Investigators immediately shift all the media attention to the Las Vegas area.
His photo was on television, on the news. There'd been a media blitz about the pizza killers being in Las Vegas area.
Eddie?
It doesn't take long for the move to pay off. Just before midnight on Christmas Eve, police receive an anonymous tip that Mitch and Ruby are holed up in a motel nearby.
I went out there and checked with the clerk, and when I described him, and he had seen the photo on television, he says, well, yeah, it could be him.
It's around 2 a.m. and Las Vegas police surround the motel. If it is Mitch, they don't know how he's going to react. They don't know if he's going to go out in a blaze of glory.
We went in naturally at gunpoint because he was allegedly armed and dangerous. I had one officer out back and one in front. So we walked up to the door, got beside it. I knocked at the door.
The officers are ready for anything, but thankfully, the encounter doesn't end in violence.
The door opened and Mitch just puts his hands up. Ruby's sitting on the bed behind him.
He was very serene. I mean, he didn't say anything. She was basically the same way. It probably went down as the easiest arrest I ever made. I was kind of surprised at that.
I think they realized that they were completely outnumbered and there was always firepower and automatic weapons facing them.
When they started checking and do a search room, they looked under the mattress and there was the gun.
They still had the murder weapon in their possession, as well as the cash bag from the robbery in Glendale.
Almost 3 weeks after the first Domino shooting, the suspects are finally in custody. But despite the couple's timid behavior, police discover evidence that their crime spree had been far from over.
On a table by the bed, they'd noticed some pages torn out of a phone book, and they'd circled some pizza places in the area, like they were planning their next robbery.
Oh, it's 100% they were going to commit more murders.
Investigators are quick to notify surviving victims of the arrest.
A few days after I had made the identifications, I then went back to Michigan for Christmas. And it was Christmas Day, the phone rang, and it was someone telling me that he'd been captured in Las Vegas.
Mitchell Sims and Ruby Paget are immediately brought in for questioning. While Mitch remains tight-lipped, Ruby decides to tell investigators everything.
She has no problem throwing her boyfriend under the bus. She says it was all his idea and goes into great detail about how he killed John Harrigan.
Susan Paget started the day by casing the store in Glendale. They then went to a store where they bought rope and a knife. That night, at their hotel room, they ordered pizza to be delivered to their room, but it was a trap from the beginning.
As soon as John Harrigan walked into that motel room, Mitch attacked him. He kneed him in the stomach and then robbed him at gunpoint.
This young man didn't resist at all. He was compliant.
Ruby says Mitch didn't want to shoot John because of the noise, so he decided to tie him up instead.
They wanted to leave him at the motel, but the plan got more complicated as time went on.
Sims shoved a sock in his mouth and then tied a rag around that sock so he could barely breathe.
They filled the tub with water and dumped Harrigan inside it. He never had a chance.
I think Mitchell kind of panicked in the sense that the reason that he was fingered in the South Carolina homicides was that there was a surviving victim.
She claimed Mitch held Harrigan's head under the water until he was sure he was dead. They then went back to the pizza store and robbed it.
Ruby Paget never took any responsibility for the murder. She said she just went along for the ride and basically blamed Sims.
The witnesses, however, don't see it that way.
She was a knowing participant. She was actively involved. I think the two of them were, they fed off each other very much. I think one made the other worse and vice versa.
The couple are charged with multiple crimes in 2 different states. But can prosecutors convince a jury to convict them both? Coming up, Mitchell Sims and Ruby Paget stand trial for murder.
The fact cried out literally for the death penalty.
After a month-long manhunt, Mitchell Sims and Ruby Paget have finally been arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada. Although their crime spree began in South Carolina, prosecutors ultimately decide to begin with the case in Glendale, California.
We wanted them to come back here immediately because the first killing was here. However, California had a better case against Ruby than we had.
Ruby Paget was not on the radar for anything. She wasn't involved in the South Carolina murders to anyone's knowledge. So she really came on the radar when she was involved with the Glendale murder and attempted murders.
The charges were 3 counts of armed robbery, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of first-degree murder with special circumstances.
If convicted, Ruby faces life in prison, and Mitchell could get the death penalty.
The prosecution didn't seek death to her because the facts related to her involvement were very different than Sims' involvement.
Lawyers representing the couple decide to separate them. Ruby is the first to stand trial in January of 1987. The 21-year-old pleads not guilty.
Her defense was that she was in the motel room, but, she did not help Mr. Sims in any way. She had no idea he was going to do that.
The prosecution theory at trial was that Paget had to be an active participant because it would have been too difficult for Mitchell Sims alone to drag the hog-tied John Harrigan into the bathroom and lift him into the bathtub by himself.
After 6 days of deliberation, the jury returns its verdict. They find her guilty of first-degree murder and armed robbery. But she is acquitted on the 2 counts of attempted murder.
Clearly, Ruby Paget was not the leader in this escapade. Sims was the one who was the former employee who held the grudge.
I think the jury felt some sympathy for her, and instead of giving her the death penalty, they gave her life in prison without the possibility of parole.
On March 10th, 1987, Mitchell Sims' trial begins.
The prosecution described him as an angry and violent man who was out seeking revenge, but once he started killing people, he got a taste for it.
It's indicative of Mitchell Sims feeling like he's the aggrieved person. He's been wrong, and the way for him to regain his power is to make other people the victims.
Mitchell's attorneys don't attempt to prove his innocence. Instead, they focus on removing the death penalty.
The special circumstances of Harrigan's murder was a plan to lure him into a trap, but they claimed that wasn't the case.
They were arguing it was an accident, that they didn't tie him up in such a way that he couldn't get himself out if he wanted to.
And while the autopsy listed strangulation as the cause of death, drowning could not be ruled out as an additional cause.
The defense theory was that there was no intent to kill John Harrigan, that John Harrigan died accidentally when he struck his head in the bathtub and fell unconscious in the water that was running. But it was a preposterous defense.
The jury doesn't believe it either.
That was ridiculous because he had a ligature mark in his neck deep enough that he was probably already passed out. I didn't have any doubt. I knew he did it.
On May 20th, 1987, Mitchell Sims is found guilty on all charges.
At sentencing, Mitch's lawyers tried to argue that he shouldn't be completely held responsible for his crimes because of a history of childhood abuse.
Mitchell Sims' family background was one of the most horrific that I've encountered in my entire career as a forensic psychiatrist. There was, by his stepfather, verbal abuse, physical abuse, which were beatings of Mitchell with his fists.
The defense claims that when Mitchell was 7 years old, his now deceased stepfather also began sexually abusing him.
This occurred over a prolonged period of time, and as a result, Mitchell became so traumatized and reclusive that he oftentimes just sat staring into space.
It had apparently gotten worse over time. They claimed that Mitch's stepfather had apparently forced him to have sex with one of his sisters and his mother.
We heard the testimony about Sims and his horrible childhood. It was one of the worst I've heard. If there was any disagreement between jurors, it was during the penalty phase.
But in the end, the jury's decision was unanimous.
They voted for the death penalty, and at that time in California, that lit the gas chamber.
My thought process was, he killed John Harrigan. He's 21 years old. He was just starting his life. But on top of that, he had brothers and sisters who didn't kill anybody.
I was there when the death sentence was handed down. For me, it was very much a relief. It was a closing chapter on this whole thing.
Mitch is then tried in South Carolina for the murders of Chris Zare and Gary Melky. The results are the same.
I've been around a lot of people who've been guilty of murder. He was very callous. I've never seen somebody so cold.
The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before finding him guilty. That resulted in a second death penalty.
But no punishment could ever help the families of the victims make sense of their loss. What started as a bitter man's need for revenge and escalated into a murder spree that devastated countless lives.
A lot of people that promise the jobs, they get cheated out of a bonus, they quit their jobs and move on. Mitch Sims didn't do that. He decided to take out his vengeance.
I still remember it, and I still remember the incredible loss that occurred with just outstanding individuals and the tremendous, horrible ramifications that it had with their families.
Had Melky not survived the shooting, and if he wasn't able to tell the cops that Mitchell Sims did it, who knows how many more murders Sims would have committed across the entire country.